Yeah, I mean, in fact, I think like it's probably worth trying to determine what we're talking about when we say pin-ups, because actually, of course, like painting of women. Let's talk about sort of straight heteronormative pin-ups for the most part to start with. Like that idea of the classical nude and then the kind of neoclassical nude, which is kind of presents in 19th century art this particular kind of fantasized female body that gets to be naked because it's not, they're often kind of allegorical figures like of justice or some kind of national allegory, or they get to be goddesses from Egyptian mythology. Venus, for example, Botticelli's Venus is a very famous example of that. They're not quite pin-ups, but the instinct is sort of the same in some senses. It's a way of, presenting a certain kind of female body, for, in many cases, a presumed male gaze. The idea that, straight men are the kind of consumers of this kind of imagery. And that's something which art historians have written about, extensively. Something goes back to the classical age.
Yeah, and it's kind of that idea of conveying like grander ideas through like the physicality and the sensuality of the naked body.
Yeah, so the kind of highbrow version of that, is that the allegorical female body in historical art is something that gets to be not pornography or not even erotic, really. It gets, although of course it is, and it was, and that becomes a bit of a kind of sop. No, this isn't pornography. This is grand painting.
Don't let Matt near the Roman statues. He'll get too excited.
And of course, like all of the conversations then, all of the sort of tropes, which then become codified in pin-ups, the way that women's bodies are drawn specifically, and we'll talk about some of those specifics later on. The poses they're using, the kind of implied relationship with the viewer, their relationship to kind of things like domesticity and sexuality, and their relationship between their brains and their bodies. All of these things, all of these tropes, they are encoded in a long, hundreds of years, centuries long kind of set of culturally contingent ideas about how the female body is drawn. And like, again, we're not going to go into the kind of deep, complex and many layered decades of feminist theorizing about the history of the nude in art. We can talk about that, but I think as we get into pin-ups per se, it's worth bearing all that in mind, that these have a kind of history that underpin them. Like all images, the pin-up images we're talking about exist as a product of a certain kind of cultural chauvinism that's been produced over several centuries in the Western imagination. And also, right, like you talk about cinema, and we'll talk about that as well. Of course, all of these art forms which intersect with each other, they then produce and change and reinforce each other in mutually interesting ways. Once the Hollywood starlet moves onto the photograph and then into the illustration, and then onto the nose cone of the plane, of course, then that moves back into Hollywood as that particular kind of body, that particular kind of femininity gets idealized. And then you have the versions of it that are subversive and are complex. So, yeah, all of that is to say, when we talk about pin-ups, we're sort of, in some senses, arbitrarily drawing a little bit of a line. But I wondered if you knew, to find our starting point maybe, when the word pin-up first enters kind of general usage in English in America.
I don't know the specific, but if I was to guess, I'm gonna say 1936.
Oh, you're really close. That's good. That's very good. You've obviously done your research. So the OED basically cites the year as 1941. Okay. I'm drawing a lot here on the PhD thesis of a scholar called Elena Lipsos, who I met many, many years ago. Did a talk actually when I used to run a talk series up in Camden, who wrote a PhD on on the histories of pinups, and kind of interestingly subversive take on them actually. So I'm referring a lot to her PhD thesis. So she basically sort of says, in 1941 we get the first, that's the earliest that the OED cite it, and they cite July 7th issue of Life magazine that year, with a woman called Dorothy Lamour as the quote U.S. Army's #1 pinup. Right. So there you go. That's exactly what you're talking about. Film star turned pinup. And what is a pinup, right? Why are they called pinups, Tom?
If I was to guess, it's because it is an image that can be pinned up on a wall anywhere.
That's right. So these images basically, particularly during World War II, although again not originarily, but this is sort of where the kind of concept really takes hold. You could cut out or pull out a page from a magazine. Remember those things, kids? And in your bunk, in your mess hall, in your kind of carry case, your trunk, your steamer trunk, you could, with a little drawing pin, with a tack, with a pin, you could pin these girls up, and they got to be kind of, basically kind of fantasy material, erotic material, for these men who were away from home, right? So very, very quickly, magazines, and of course, like this period, the 1930s and 40s, coincides with really the rise of popular publishing. It's making mass production much cheaper. Color printing, in particular, is something that's really comes into its own in the 1930s and 40s. Begin to actually start explicitly printing what get called centerfolds. So big pictures across this double page spread in the middle of a magazine that you could pull out, take the staples out, pull out, and pin up and make a little poster. And those pages basically are the where we get the term from, right? Very, very straightforwardly. The most important, I suppose, of these, and the most influential of these, and the home to kind of most of the most interesting one, the most interesting and famous artists. And we're going to talk about three artists today in particular: George Petty, Alberto Vargas, and Gil Elvgren, three American, or actually in the case of Vargas, Peruvian American illustrators. It was like getting their stuff published in magazines, which really, really, cemented them in the American popular imagination. And in the case of Petty and then subsequently Vargas, that magazine was Esquire magazine. Do you know much about Esquire magazine?
I don't, but I'm excited for you to tell me more.
Yeah, so Esquire magazine, I think, is still going, actually. And it was a kind of, I don't know what's the best way to explain it. It's sort of like, kind of a sort of general men's magazine without many of the connotations that I guess that term has taken on post the 1990s. Although, of course, that 1990s, lad mag culture has a lot owing to that, retrograde era of the 30s.
It's not Nuts and Zoo.
It's sort of, it is the precursor to that, but it's not Playboy, I guess, is the point. Like, as we'll talk about and we'll come to, when Playboy was first published in 1954, it really put an end initially to this kind of magazine, a sort of gentler era. But Esquire is this magazine which published sort of, fiction. It published little bits of news. It published kind of lifestyle stuff, I guess we'd call it today. It published these pinups. And so probably the first kind of iconic pinup artist is this guy called George Petty. And he'd been, his stuff was so, if you want to Google image search his work, Tom, and while I'm talking, like, let's have a look at it, because he was like, absolutely the kind of, originator or kind of, delineator of this style. So much so that his style the way that he painted girls became known as like the petty girl.